The rain arrived with Eleanor Hartwell, as though the heavens themselves wished to mark her passage into obscurity. Through the streaked windows of the hired coach, she watched the Ashford estate materialize from the autumn mist, like something conjured from a melancholy dream, all grey stone and ivy-clad towers, its chimneys disappearing into low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down upon the Derbyshire countryside with the weight of centuries. She was 26 years old, educated beyond her station and impoverished below her breeding, and she had come to this place with nothing but a battered trunk, a worn travelling cloak that had once been her mother's, and the quiet resignation of one who has learned that hope is a luxury she can no longer afford. The wheels churned through muddy ruts, each turn bringing her closer to a life she understood with painful clarity. She would be invisible here, a shadow moving through gilded rooms, her thoughts unspoken, her presence noted only when absent. 5 years, perhaps more, stretching before her like an endless corridor of identical days, reading aloud to women who would never truly see her, managing correspondence for ladies who would forget her name the moment she departed, existing in that peculiar purgatory reserved for gentlewomen without fortune, too refined for servitude yet too poor for society. The carriage lurched to a halt before the great entrance, and Eleanor gathered her threadbare shawl more tightly around her shoulders, not against the cold but against the future. She had been Miss Hartwell once, daughter of a respected scholar, raised among books and music and the assumption of a decent match, but her father's death had revealed debts instead of inheritance, and her distant cousins had offered pity but no home. She thought, as the footman opened the carriage door and rain misted against her face, that this was not tragedy, but simply the quiet diminishment of circumstance, the way a candle flame grows smaller, not through sudden gust, but through the patient burning of hours. She stepped down onto the wet gravel, her half-boots thin enough that she felt every stone, and looked up at the house that would be her world. Somewhere within those walls, the Dowager Countess Ashford waited a woman Eleanor had never met, but whose reputation preceded her like winter before the snow, all coldness and exacting standards. Eleanor smoothed her skirts, lifted her chin with the dignity her mother had insisted upon, even in poverty's final days, and walked toward the entrance. She would be what she must be, competent, courteous, invisible. She would endure with grace, maintain her education in private hours, and ask nothing of the world but the small mercy of employment. The door opened before her, and Eleanor Hartwell stepped across the threshold into the autumn of her obscurity, carrying within her all the unspoken dreams she had taught herself to forget. The Dowager Countess Ashford received Eleanor in the morning room, a chamber so perfectly appointed that even the firelight seemed arranged for maximum effect, and the woman herself, tall, angular, dressed in unrelieved black, despite 3 years of widowhood, surveyed her new companion, with the detached assessment one might give a piece of furniture being considered for purchase. "You come with adequate references," the Countess said, her voice carrying the particular crispness of one accustomed to immediate obedience, "and I am told you read French and Italian in addition to English. You will attend me each morning at 9 to manage my correspondence. You will read aloud in the afternoons. I cannot abide novels, only history and sermons, and you will accompany me on calls when I require a sensible presence. You will take your meals in your room, you will not engage the other servants in idle conversation, and you will remember that discretion is the highest virtue in your position." Eleanor stood with her hands folded, her spine straight, and murmured her understanding, feeling the familiar constriction of her new reality settling around her like a too tight bodice. She had known it would be thus, had prepared herself for exactly this species of benevolent tyranny, yet something in her still flinched at the casual dismissal in the Countess's tone, the assumption that Eleanor's education was merely a tool for another's convenience. Her room, when the housekeeper finally led her to it, was tucked beneath the eaves on the 3rd floor, a space so small that her trunk occupied nearly half the available area, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a window that looked out over the stable yard rather than the magnificent gardens she had glimpsed from the carriage. She unpacked her few possessions with careful precision: 3 dresses in various states of respectability, her mother's Bible with its cracked leather binding, the volume of Wordsworth her father had given her on her 16th birthday, the miniature portrait of her parents that was her only inheritance of value beyond memory. She arranged them on the small shelf as though creating an altar to the life she had lost, these fragments of a vanished world in which she had been somebody's daughter, somebody's hope, somebody who mattered. That first night, lying in the unfamiliar bed with rain drumming against the roof tiles just above her head, Eleanor made herself a promise. She would maintain her dignity, she would preserve her mind through whatever reading she could manage in her scarce free hours, and she would never, never allow herself to become bitter. She had seen what bitterness did to women in her position, how it twisted them into either obsequious servility or sharp-edged resentment, and she would not succumb to either. She would endure, she would be useful, she would make herself indispensable through competence and discretion, and if she sometimes felt the weight of all her unspoken thoughts pressing against her throat like unshed tears, well, that was simply the price one paid for survival in a world that measured worth in pounds rather than poetry, in connections rather than character, in what one possessed rather than who one was. Months passed, and then years, and Eleanor found herself moving through houses like a ghost passing through walls, leaving no mark of her presence, carrying only the same battered trunk and the growing weariness that settled into her bones like winter cold that never quite departed. The Dowager Countess dismissed her after 18 months, not for any fault, but simply because the woman had decided to remove to her daughter's household in Scotland and required no companion there, and Eleanor found herself in London, in the employ of Lady Pemberton, a cheerful widow of 40 whose townhouse near Berkeley Square glittered with gilt and gossip. Lady Pemberton was kind in her careless way, always smiling, always fluttering about like an overfed songbird, surrounding herself with other shallow creatures who discussed nothing more substantial than the latest fashions and the scandals of the season. Eleanor managed the household accounts that her employer could not be bothered with, organized the endless stream of callers, and sat silent in drawing rooms full of laughter that seemed to come from another world entirely, feeling herself become more invisible with each passing day. She left after a year when Lady Pemberton married again, a pompous colonel with a bristling moustache who made it clear he saw no need for his new wife to maintain a paid companion, and Eleanor travelled to Bath, to the anxious Mrs. Whitmore, a hypochondriac of uncertain age who required someone to read medical texts aloud, to accompany her to the pump room, to listen to endless recitations of symptoms both real and imagined. Bath in winter was a city of invalids and boredom, of the same routines repeated until Eleanor could navigate the streets with her eyes closed, could predict every conversation before it began, could feel her own mind growing smaller from disuse, despite the books she read in secret hours. Mrs. Whitmore's niece arrived from India after 14 months, and Eleanor was once again surplus to requirements, dispensable as yesterday's newspaper. She was 29 now, and she could feel something essential eroding within her, not hope, for she had released that long ago, but rather the vitality that had once made her believe her thoughts and feelings mattered to anyone, even herself. The pattern had become clear. She would always be temporary, always peripheral, always alone, moving from house to house like a piece of serviceable furniture, useful but unremarkable, and noticed only in absence. She took her meals in solitude. She spoke only when addressed. She perfected the art of seeming present while being essentially absent, and if sometimes she caught her reflection in a window and barely recognized the woman, staring back pale, quiet, fading like old ink on paper, well, that was simply the cost of survival in a world that had no place for educated women without fortune or family or future. The Thornbury residence in Mayfair was different from the moment Eleanor crossed its threshold, quieter, softer, filled with the kind of faded elegance that spoke of old money and older griefs, and Lady Thornbury herself, at 78, proved to be a woman of surprising gentleness, her lined face still beautiful, her voice warm despite the tremor of age, and she greeted Eleanor not as a servant but as a companion in the truest sense, saying, "My dear, I hope you will be happy here, for I find I am too old for formality and too lonely for silence." The house was filled with books, with music, with light that poured through tall windows onto Persian carpets worn soft by generations of feet, and Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly, though she reminded herself not to hope, not to expect anything beyond the temporary respite of a kinder employer. She had been there perhaps 3 weeks when the Duke of Greystone arrived unannounced one autumn afternoon, and Eleanor, seated in the corner of the drawing room with her needlework, while Lady Thornbury dozed, looked up at the sound of his voice in the hallway, and felt her breath catch at the sight of him. Tall, dark-haired, perhaps 34, dressed in black with only the smallest concession to mourning jewelry, his face austere and remote as a winter landscape, beautiful in the way that broken things sometimes are, when they have been carefully pieced back together, but never quite whole again. Lady Thornbury woke and embraced him with evident affection, calling him "my dear Grayson," and he bent to kiss her cheek with a tenderness that seemed at odds with the severity of his expression, and Eleanor looked away, returning to her needlework, making herself invisible as she had learned to do, expecting no introduction, no acknowledgement of her presence. But later, when Lady Thornbury had gone to rest, and Eleanor sat alone in the library attempting to make sense of Dante's Inferno in the original Italian, a book she had found on the shelves and borrowed without permission, a small rebellion she allowed herself. She heard the door open and looked up, to find the Duke standing there, his dark eyes resting on the volume in her hands with unmistakable recognition. "You read, Dante," he said, and it was not quite a question, his voice low and slightly rough as though from disuse, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks as she stood, clutching the book, and prepared to apologize for the presumption of touching his aunt's belongings, but he continued before she could speak. "In Italian, it appears. The Longfellow translation is adequate, but nothing compares to the original music of the verse." She stared at him, uncertain how to respond, aware that this was the longest conversation she had held with a gentleman of rank in 5 years, aware too of something in his gaze that was neither condescension nor idle curiosity, but rather a kind of hunger, as though he had been starving for someone who understood what he was saying, and she found herself answering honestly, without calculation. "I find the music inseparable from the meaning translation always loses something essential, like trying to explain the color of sky to someone who has never seen it." And for just a moment, something shifted in his austere face, a crack in the ice, and he almost smiled before nodding once, and leaving her alone with her book and the strange, unsettling sensation that she had been truly seen for the first time in longer than she could remember. The Duke began appearing at his aunt's residence with a frequency that seemed, to Eleanor's carefully observant eye, unusual for a man of his standing and responsibilities, he who surely had estates to manage, parliamentary duties to attend, a vast world of privilege and power that should have kept him far from a Mayfair drawing-room where an elderly woman took her tea and a paid companion sat silent in corners. At first, Eleanor told herself it meant nothing, that his increased presence was merely the natural concern of a nephew for an aging relative, but she could not help noticing the way his dark eyes would find her across a room, not with the lascivious interest she had learned to recognize and deflect during her years of service, but with something else entirely, a curiosity, perhaps, or a question he had not yet learned how to ask. He would arrive for afternoon tea and somehow contrive to sit where he might observe her without obviousness, and once, when Lady Thornbury asked Eleanor's opinion on a proposed charity for educating poor girls, Eleanor offered her thoughts with careful moderation, arguing that education was not charity but investment, that knowledge could not be unlearned, and therefore represented the only true path from poverty to independence, and she felt the weight of the Duke's attention like physical touch, saw the slight inclination of his head that might have been agreement or merely acknowledgement. Another day he found her in the morning room writing letters for Lady Thornbury, and paused to ask what she was reading for. There was always a book nearby, and her constant companions, through years of loneliness, and when she showed him the volume of Wordsworth's poetry, he quoted several lines from memory, then asked if she preferred the romantics to the moderns, and they spoke for perhaps 10 minutes about poetry and the consolations of beauty in a world that often seemed devoid of it. And Eleanor felt something dangerous unfold in her chest, a warmth she had not permitted herself in so long she had forgotten its name. He began staying for tea when previously he would have departed after a brief visit, and he would ask her opinion on matters both trivial and substantive, whether she thought the new gas lighting made reading easier or merely different, what she made of the railway expansion and its effects on the countryside, if she had thoughts on the Irish famine and the government's inadequate response, and always he listened as though her answers mattered, as though she were not merely a paid companion, but a person whose mind and judgment held value. Eleanor remained guarded, her responses polite but measured, for she had learned, through bitter experience that kindness from the privileged classes was often casual, thoughtless, extended without awareness of how it might be received by those who had so little of it, and she would not mistake courtesy for genuine interest, would not allow herself to imagine that a duke might see anything in her beyond a temporary diversion, an educated woman whose conversation provided brief respite from boredom. She assumed nothing, expected less, and yet found herself listening for his footsteps in the hall, found her heart beating faster when he entered a room, found herself taking more care with her appearance on the days she knew he might visit, and hated herself for this weakness, even as she could not entirely suppress it. This small rebellion of hope against the iron discipline of self-protection she had cultivated, like armor against a world that had never been kind. Winter arrived with silent authority, transforming London into a study of greys and whites, frost etching delicate patterns on window panes, and the library at the Thornbury residence became a sanctuary against the cold, a room of deep burgundy curtains and leather-bound volumes, where firelight cast dancing shadows across oak shelves that reached toward high ceilings, and it was here that Eleanor and the Duke began to find each other with a frequency that seemed beyond coincidence, yet never quite crossed into deliberate arrangement. She would retreat there in the late afternoons when Lady Thornbury rested, seeking solace in books as she always had, and he would appear as though the library had summoned him too, and they would sit in separate chairs at first, reading in companionable silence, until one evening he asked what she thought of Milton's justification of God's ways to man, and she answered that she found Paradise Lost more compelling as a study of pride and longing than as theology, that Satan's rebellion interested her more than Adam's fall, because it spoke to the terrible courage required to choose damnation over submission, and the Duke had looked at her with something like recognition in his dark eyes and said, "Yes, exactly that, the tragedy of a will that cannot bend, even when bending might mean salvation." And from that moment their conversations deepened like a river cutting through stone, slowly but inevitably revealing what lay beneath the surface. He spoke of his late wife with a careful honesty that seemed to cost him, describing the 5 years of her decline from consumption, how he had watched her fade like watercolor in rain, how he had held her hand through endless nights and felt helpless against the inexorable progress of disease, how her death when it finally came was both agony and terrible relief, and the guilt of that relief had haunted him through 3 years of frozen isolation, in which he had performed his duties as Duke with mechanical precision, while feeling nothing at all, until something in his voice broke slightly, and Eleanor reached across the space between their chairs to touch his hand, just once, briefly, a gesture of shared understanding that said times, "I know what it means to lose everything and continue breathing anyway." She told him pieces of her own story in return, carefully edited but true enough: her father's death when she was 19, the discovery that his scholarly reputation had been built on borrowed money and false optimism, the auction of their house and books and every material memory of her childhood, her mother's retreat into invalidism and eventual death 2 years later, leaving Eleanor alone with nothing but her education and the realization that a gentlewoman's learning was worthless without fortune to support it, that she existed in a peculiar purgatory of being too refined for service, yet too poor for society, invisible to those above her station and suspect to those below. They spoke of philosophy and found they both believed that meaning must be created rather than discovered, that the universe was indifferent but human connection could carve beauty from that indifference, and they argued about poetry, whether Keats or Shelley better understood the relationship between beauty and truth, whether art should console or challenge, whether suffering ennobled or merely destroyed, and Eleanor felt herself coming alive in ways she had forgotten were possible, felt her mind expand and sharpen against his, felt the dangerous warmth of being truly heard. The winter deepened, and their library meetings became the axis around which her days turned, and she knew this was foolish, knew she was allowing herself to care when caring could only lead to loss, but in those firelit hours she chose to set aside caution and simply exist as herself, whole and unhidden, even though she understood with perfect clarity that such moments were borrowed time, that eventually the world beyond the library doors would reassert itself, and she would return to her proper place in the shadows, alone. The whispers began like frost creeping across glass, subtle at first but spreading with inexorable certainty through the corridors and servants' halls of the Thornbury residence, and Eleanor became aware of them, the way one becomes aware of a change in temperature, a slight chill where warmth had been. Mrs. Hendricks, Lady Thornbury's lady's maid of 30 years, began offering Eleanor tight-lipped smiles that held no warmth, her eyes sharp with judgment and something that might have been satisfaction at seeing someone brought low. And one afternoon when Eleanor passed the morning room she heard Mrs. Hendricks speaking to the housekeeper in tones meant to carry, "It's unseemly is what it is, His Grace spending so much time here," and always asking after times her asterisk, as though a paid companion should be of any interest to a duke. But then some women know how to make themselves interesting, if you take my meaning. Eleanor felt the words like a slap, the familiar shame that came with being misunderstood, misjudged, reduced to the oldest and cruelest of assumptions about women without protection or position, and she walked on with her spine straight and her face composed, because she had learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged cruelty. That dignity was the only armor available to those who had nothing else. The other servants began to treat her differently too. The footman, who had always been polite, now avoided her eyes. The cook, who had sometimes sent up extra tea, now sent only what was strictly necessary, and Eleanor found herself once again inhabiting that peculiar no-man's land she had occupied in every house where she had served. Too educated and refined to be comfortable below stairs, where at least there was companionship among equals, too poor and employed to be accepted above stairs, where she might have found society among those who shared her learning. She existed in the shadows between worlds, belonging nowhere, welcome nowhere, and the Duke's continued attention, which she had begun to treasure, despite her better judgment, now felt like a curse that illuminated her rather than a kindness, making her visible in ways that brought only scrutiny and censure. The Duke himself seemed utterly oblivious to the scandal his visits were creating, or perhaps, Eleanor thought bitterly, he simply did not care because men of his rank could afford not to care, could dispense kindness or attention as they pleased, without suffering consequences that would destroy a woman in her position. He could walk away unscathed, while she would be marked forever as someone who had presumed above her station, who had encouraged inappropriate interest, who had failed to maintain proper boundaries. She began avoiding the library during hours when he might appear, taking her tea in her room rather than the drawing room, accepting every errand that would take her outside the house and away from the possibility of encounter. And she hated herself for this retreat even as she understood its necessity, hated the world that made simple conversation between two lonely people into something sordid and suspicious, hated most of all the small part of her heart that still hoped he might notice her absence and wonder why she had withdrawn, that still wished, despite everything, that she might matter to someone, that she might be seen as something other than a temporary convenience or a cautionary tale. The package arrived on a February morning when sleet tapped against the windows like impatient fingers, and Eleanor was helping Lady Thornbury sort through correspondence in the morning room, and when the butler presented it on a silver tray with a small card bearing the Duke's crest, Eleanor felt her heart constrict, with something between dread and longing, because she knew before opening it that whatever lay within would require a response she was not prepared to give. Lady Thornbury gestured for her to open it with an encouraging smile that suggested she knew more than she revealed, and Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a book bound in deep green leather with gilt lettering, and when she saw the title her breath caught, because it was a first edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese, published just 3 years prior and already considered a masterwork of romantic verse, the kind of volume that belonged in collectors' libraries rather than in the hands of paid companions who owned nothing of value and had no right to such treasures. The card was brief, written in the Duke's precise hand. "You mentioned once that you found Sonnet Exlethin to be the truest expression of love you had encountered in modern verse. I thought you should have your own copy rather than borrowing from my aunt's shelves, Greystone," and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes because the gift was impossible in every conceivable way, far too intimate and personal to accept from a man to whom she was nothing but his aunt's employee, far too valuable for someone in her position to possess without inviting exactly the kind of speculation that already poisoned the household's atmosphere. Yet refusing it would be an insult to his generosity and kindness, would suggest she thought ill of his motives, when she knew his heart was without calculation or impropriety, that he had simply wanted to give her something beautiful because he understood she had so little beauty in her carefully circumscribed life. She held the book with trembling hands and felt the weight of the choice before her. To accept was to acknowledge that something existed between them beyond the bounds of employer and companion, to admit that their library conversations had meant something more than intellectual exercise, to open a door she had been desperately trying to keep closed because she knew where such openings led for women of no fortune and uncertain position, knew that hope was the most dangerous gift anyone could offer her, because hope required vulnerability, and vulnerability invited devastation. Yet to refuse was to deny the truth of what she felt, to reject not just the gift, but the gesture of seeing her as someone worthy of thoughtfulness and care, to retreat once more into the protective shadows where she had learned to live half visible and untouchable. "It's beautiful, is it not?" Lady Thornbury asked gently, and Eleanor managed to nod and whisper, "Yes, extraordinarily so," and the elderly woman reached across to pat her hand and said, "Then you must accept it, my dear, for beautiful things should go to those who can truly appreciate them." And Eleanor understood she was not speaking only of the book, but of something larger and more terrifying, some future possibility that Eleanor could not allow herself to imagine. She accepted with formal words of gratitude that felt hollow against the magnitude of what the gift represented, and that night in her small room she opened the book to Sonnet XL30 and read, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," and felt something break open inside her chest, some carefully maintained defense crumbling under the weight of longing she had forbidden herself to acknowledge, and she knew that this gift would haunt her precisely because it was given without expectation or demand, freely offered to someone the world deemed unworthy of such generosity, and that was perhaps the cruelest kindness of all, to be seen and valued when she had spent 5 years learning to be invisible. The summons came 3 days after Eleanor had begun avoiding the library altogether, delivered by a housemaid who said that Lady Thornbury wished to see Miss Hartwell in her private chambers at 2 o'clock, and Eleanor climbed the stairs with trepidation coiling in her stomach, because she knew this must be the dismissal she had been anticipating, the inevitable consequence of allowing herself to become visible in ways that invited scandal and speculation. And she rehearsed in her mind the dignified words she would use to accept her fate without protest or tears, the practiced calm that had carried her through 5 years of precarious employment and countless small humiliations. Lady Thornbury was seated by the window in her sitting room when Eleanor entered, the afternoon light softening the lines of her elderly face, and she gestured to the chair opposite, with a gentle smile that confused Eleanor because it held no censure, no disappointment, only a kind of knowing sadness that suggested the conversation to come would not follow the script Eleanor had prepared. "Sit with me, child," the old woman said, and Eleanor obeyed, folding her hands in her lap and waiting for judgment to fall. But instead, Lady Thornbury reached across and took one of Eleanor's hands in her own papery grip and said, "My nephew has not smiled in 3 years, not since Catherine died after that terrible wasting illness that took her so slowly. We all watched helpless as she faded, and he became a ghost himself, going through the motions of living without any light behind his eyes, and I had despaired of ever seeing him take joy in anything again until you came to this house. And now he smiles when he speaks of a book you recommended or an observation you made, and there is life in his face again, hope, and you are afraid of that, are you not?" Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes and managed to whisper, "My lady, the household talks, they say things that suggest impropriety where there is none, and I cannot afford such talk. I have nothing and no one, and my reputation is all I possess." But Lady Thornbury shook her head and replied, "You think you are afraid of impropriety, dear girl, but that is not what truly frightens you. You are afraid of hope itself, afraid of being seen and valued, because you have spent so many years learning to be invisible, to want nothing, to expect nothing, and the possibility that someone might genuinely care for you, that you might matter to another soul, terrifies you more than any gossip ever could, because hope requires vulnerability, and vulnerability means you might be hurt, might be disappointed, might discover that you were wrong to let yourself believe you deserved happiness." The words struck Eleanor like stones thrown at glass, cracking through defenses she had not even known she was maintaining, and she found herself weeping quietly, while Lady Thornbury held her hand and stroked it with infinite gentleness, and the elderly woman continued, "I do not know what will come of this connection between you and my nephew, whether it will lead where your heart might wish, or whether circumstances will prove too difficult to overcome. But I do know that retreating into shadows, because you are afraid to stand in the light, is a kind of death, a slow extinction of the self. And you deserve more than that, Eleanor. You deserve to be seen and known and valued for the remarkable woman you are, not despite your circumstances, but as a whole person worthy of consideration and care." Eleanor could not speak, could only sit with tears streaming down her face while something fundamental shifted inside her chest, some locked door beginning to open despite her fear, and when she finally found her voice, she asked, "What should I do?" And Lady Thornbury smiled and said, "Whatever your heart tells you when you stop being afraid to listen to it." Eleanor gave her notice on a grey March morning, when fog pressed against the windows, like searching fingers, and the world beyond seemed insubstantial as dreams, and she delivered the words to Lady Thornbury with steady voice and downcast eyes, explaining that she had secured a position with the Duchess of Somerset in London, a prestigious household where her services would be well compensated and her duties clearly defined. And though these were true facts, they were also careful lies, because the real truth was that she was fleeing, running from the terrible possibility that Lady Thornbury's words had awakened in her heart, from the hope that had begun growing despite all her efforts to uproot it, from the unbearable tension of existing in the same house as the Duke of Greystone, knowing that every conversation pulled her deeper into longing she could not afford and dared not acknowledge. Lady Thornbury accepted the resignation with sad resignation in her eyes, as though she understood exactly what Eleanor was doing and why. But she said only, "I shall miss you, my dear, and I wish you every happiness in your new position." And Eleanor felt the weight of that gentle disappointment like stones in her pockets, dragging her down even as she told herself she was making the sensible choice, the safe choice, the only choice available to a woman of no fortune who had learned through bitter experience that reaching for things beyond her station led only to humiliation and loss. The Duke was absent when she made her announcement, away at his country estate on business, and Eleanor told herself this was a mercy because she would not have to see his face or hear whatever careful, courteous words he might offer in response to her departure, would not have to witness whether he felt relief or indifference, or something more complicated that she did not dare name. And she spent the following days packing her few possessions with mechanical efficiency, while the household whispered around her, and the lady's maid made pointed comments about companions who grew too bold in their presumptions, paid the price. He returned 3 days before her scheduled departure, and Eleanor knew the moment his carriage arrived because she heard the commotion in the entrance hall and felt her heart begin racing with anticipation and dread. But he did not seek her out that day or the next, and she moved through the house like a ghost, half hoping and half fearing that he would demand an explanation, would ask why she was leaving, would give her some reason to reconsider this flight into safety and solitude. On her final evening, Lady Thornbury held a small dinner and the Duke attended, and across the table Eleanor felt his gaze upon her several times. But when she dared to meet his eyes, his expression was unreadable, neither hurt nor relieved, neither pleading nor dismissive, just carefully controlled and distant, as though he had already accepted her departure as inevitable. And after dinner, when she came to bid Lady Thornbury good night, the Duke was standing by the library door, and he said simply, "I wish you well in your new position, Miss Hartwell." And she replied, "Thank you, Your Grace," and that was all. No grand speeches or dramatic revelations, just formal courtesies exchanged between two people who had once talked of poetry and loss and loneliness in the quiet hours of winter evenings, and Eleanor told herself as she climbed the stairs to her room for the last time that this was exactly what she had wanted, this clean and unremarkable ending that would allow her to return to the invisible life she had known before hope had made her vulnerable, though the tears that came unbidden in the darkness suggested her heart understood what her mind refused to admit, that she was not fleeing toward safety, but away from the most dangerous and precious thing she had ever been offered, the possibility of being truly seen and genuinely valued by another soul. Months passed in the Duchess of Somerset's London townhouse, like water flowing over stones, each day wearing away another small piece of Eleanor, until she sometimes looked in the mirror and barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman staring back. And though the rooms were gilt and magnificent, draped in silks and filled with hothouse flowers even in winter, there was a suffocating quality to the luxury that made Eleanor feel as though she were slowly drowning in velvet and propriety and endless, meaningless demands. The Duchess was a woman of 60 with the temperament of a spoiled child, given to sudden rages over trivialities, a letter delivered 5 minutes late, a ribbon the wrong shade of blue, Eleanor's failure to anticipate some unspoken preference, and then equally sudden episodes of cloying affection, where she would shower Eleanor with cast-off jewelry and expired invitations to events Eleanor could never attend. Gifts that felt more like mockery than kindness, reminders of the chasm between their positions that no amount of shared time could bridge. Eleanor performed her duties with mechanical precision, reading aloud from novels she did not absorb, writing letters in the Duchess's overwrought style, organizing social calendars for gatherings she would never join, and all the while she felt herself becoming precisely what she had feared most during those first desperate months of companionship 5 years ago. Invisible, interchangeable, a function rather than a person, valued only for her utility and easily replaced should she fail to provide adequate service or sufficient entertainment. At night in her room, which was larger and finer than any she had occupied before, decorated in pale green silk with a view of the garden, Eleanor would sit by the window and think of Lady Thornbury's library, of winter afternoons, when the Duke would settle into the chair across from hers and they would discuss Wordsworth or Keats or the nature of grief, conversations that ranged freely through philosophy and literature and personal revelation. And she would remember the way he listened, as though her words truly mattered, as though her thoughts had value beyond their ability to distract or amuse. And the remembering was both comfort and torment, because she had chosen to leave that possibility behind. She had brought with her the volume of Browning he had given her, that dangerous gift she should have returned but could not bear to relinquish. And sometimes she would open it and read, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," and feel tears burning in her throat, because she had been offered something precious and had run from it out of fear disguised as practicality, out of pride disguised as self-preservation, and now she existed in this golden cage of her own choosing, safe from hope, and therefore safe from disappointment, but also safe from joy, from connection, from the terrifying vulnerability of being truly seen. The Duchess noticed nothing of Eleanor's internal desolation, concerned only with whether her companion was available to read to her during headaches or accompany her on tedious social calls, and Eleanor moved through her days like a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's life, going through motions that no longer held meaning, and she understood with growing clarity that she had not escaped danger by leaving Lady Thornbury's house, but had instead traded one kind of death for another, choosing slow extinction over the risk of living fully, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a stone she could neither swallow nor expel. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, when London was draped in unseasonable fog, and Eleanor was reading aloud from a tedious novel about virtuous governesses that the Duchess had selected specifically because it flattered her own sense of benevolence, and when the footman brought the silver salver with the single envelope, Eleanor's heart contracted painfully because she recognized Lady Thornbury's spidery handwriting, even before she saw the black bordered edge that signaled mourning or illness, and the Duchess waved her hand impatiently, saying, "Well, open it if you must, though I cannot imagine who would be writing to you," the dismissive tone making clear that Eleanor's personal correspondence was an irritating interruption to the morning's entertainment. Eleanor's hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper, and the words swam before her eyes. Lady Thornbury gravely ill, asking for Eleanor specifically, hoping she might come if her circumstances permitted, and the letter, written by the housekeeper, because the lady herself was too weak to hold a pen, and Eleanor felt the world tilt sideways, because this woman, who had shown her unexpected kindness, who had tried to teach her that she deserved more than invisible servitude, was dying and wanted her presence, and the wanting mattered more than Eleanor could articulate even to herself. She looked up to find the Duchess watching her with sharp curiosity, and said carefully, "Lady Thornbury, my former employer, is gravely ill and has requested that I visit her if possible," and she heard the pleading note in her own voice, hated herself for it even as she could not suppress it, and the Duchess's expression shifted from curiosity to cold calculation, as she said, "Out of the question. I'm afraid Lady Pemberton is calling this afternoon, and I require you to help me receive her, and then we have correspondence to manage. And really, Eleanor, I cannot spare you for social calls to previous employers, no matter how ill they may claim to be." The refusal landed like a physical blow, and Eleanor sat very still as something crystallized inside her, some core of herself that had been slowly reforming during these hollow months of golden captivity. And she heard herself say with a clarity that surprised them both, "Then I must tender my resignation, Your Grace," effective immediately, and the Duchess's face flushed with outrage as she sputtered about contracts and obligations and the impossibility of finding a replacement on no notice. But Eleanor was already standing, already moving toward the door, already choosing for the first time in 5 years to honor what she wanted rather than what was expected or safe or sensible. The Duchess called after her that she would provide no reference, that Eleanor would never find another position, that she was throwing away her future out of misplaced sentiment, and all of this was certainly true. Every word a nail in the coffin of Eleanor's prospects, but she climbed the stairs to her room and began packing her trunk anyway, hands steady now with purpose, because Lady Thornbury was dying and had asked for her, and this mattered more than security or reputation, or the careful preservation of a life that had already become a kind of death. And as she folded her few dresses and wrapped her books in brown paper, Eleanor felt something unfurling in her chest that might have been terror, or might have been the first trembling shoots of freedom, the recognition that she was capable of choosing connection over safety, of risking everything for something that could not be measured in wages or references or social standing. And by afternoon she was in a hired carriage, traveling north toward Lady Thornbury's house, toward the unknown consequences of this reckless act of love and loyalty, toward the possibility that she might arrive too late, or that her presence might mean nothing, or that this decision would leave her utterly destitute, but also toward the certainty that she could not live with herself if she chose comfort over compassion, duty over devotion, and for the first time since she had fled the Duke's quiet regard and Lady Thornbury's gentle wisdom, Eleanor felt fully, terrifyingly, magnificently alive. Eleanor arrived at Lady Thornbury's house as twilight was settling over the gardens like a benediction, the sky streaked with violet and gold, and the butler who answered the door recognized her immediately, his professional composure cracking just enough to reveal relief as he said, "Miss Hartwell, thank God you've come. Her ladyship has been asking for you," and he led her not to the familiar sitting rooms but up the grand staircase to the family chambers. Through corridors Eleanor had never walked before because companions did not venture into such intimate spaces, and when he opened the door to Lady Thornbury's bedroom, Eleanor saw first the massive canopied bed, where the old woman lay propped against pillows, looking impossibly small and frail, and then she saw the Duke sitting in a chair pulled close to the bedside, his dark hair disheveled, his face hollow with exhaustion and sleepless vigil, and their eyes met across the room with a jolt of recognition that contained everything they had left unsaid during Eleanor's abrupt departure months before. Lady Thornbury's eyes opened at the sound of the door, and when she saw Eleanor a smile transformed her wasted features as she whispered, "You came. Child, I feared you would not." And Eleanor crossed to the bed and took the old woman's hand, which felt light as paper and cold, despite the fire burning in the grate, and she said with tears threatening, "Of course I came, my lady, how could I not when you asked for me?" And Lady Thornbury squeezed her fingers with surprising strength and said, "Because you are sensible and I am dying and there is no practical reason for you to risk your position." But her eyes were warm with understanding that Eleanor had chosen connection over practicality, had finally chosen with her heart rather than her fears. The Duke rose and offered Eleanor his chair, and when their hands brushed during the exchange, Eleanor felt the same electric awareness that had frightened her into flight. But now it seemed less dangerous than precious, and this ability, they had to affect each other so profoundly. And he said quietly, "I'll have them bring another chair." But Lady Thornbury shook her head and said, "Stay, both of you, I want you near." And so they arranged themselves on either side of her bed and began the ancient ritual of vigil, the waiting that is both gift and burden, the accompanying of a soul toward its final threshold. The hours passed in strange suspension, sometimes filled with whispered conversation, when Lady Thornbury had strength for it, sometimes heavy with silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the old woman's labored breathing. And in those quiet spaces, Eleanor and the Duke spoke to each other with new honesty, their voices low, so as not to disturb their patient. And he told her that his aunt's illness had come suddenly, that he had been here for a week watching her fade, and Eleanor told him about the Duchess's refusal and her own reckless resignation, and he looked at her with something like wonder and said, "You gave up everything to come here?" And she replied simply, "Not everything. I gained the knowledge that I could still choose love over safety." And the word hung between them, love, with all its implications and impossibilities and terrifying promises. Near midnight, Lady Thornbury stirred and gestured for Eleanor to lean close, and when Eleanor did, the old woman whispered with fierce clarity, "Don't let fear make you small. Child, I did that for too many years, and I regret every cautious choice. Every moment I chose propriety over passion." And Eleanor felt tears spill over, because these words were both blessing and command, permission and challenge, and Lady Thornbury turned her head to look at her nephew and said, "You too. Alexander, don't waste what you've been given." And then she closed her eyes with a sigh of contentment, as though having delivered this final wisdom she could rest. As dawn broke pale and pink through the windows, painting the room in gentle light, Lady Thornbury took one last peaceful breath and simply did not take another, slipping away so quietly that Eleanor almost missed the moment of transition, and she and the Duke sat in stunned silence on either side of the empty shell that had housed so much wisdom and kindness, and then, without speaking, they reached across the bed and clasped hands, united in grief that felt clean and shared, mourning together as equals for the first time, no longer separated by the walls of class and propriety that Eleanor had so carefully maintained. And in that moment of loss, Eleanor understood that Lady Thornbury had given them both a final gift, not just her blessing, but the stripping away of all pretense, leaving them raw and honest and finally, terrifyingly, ready to see each other clearly. The will reading took place 3 days after the funeral in Lady Thornbury's study, a room Eleanor had never entered during her employment because it had been the old woman's private sanctuary, and now she sat uncomfortably on a straight-backed chair while the solicitor, a dry elderly man named Mr. Pemberton, arranged his papers with meticulous precision, and the Duke stood by the window looking out at gardens still beautiful, despite being touched by early summer heat, his black mourning clothes making him seem even more remote than usual, and Eleanor told herself she would leave as soon as the formalities concluded, because surely she had no business being present for the division of Lady Thornbury's estate among her family. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and began reading in his papery voice, and Eleanor barely listened as he detailed bequests to servants and donations to charitable causes and the expected inheritance of the house and its contents to the Duke. But then the solicitor's tone changed slightly as he said, "And to Miss Eleanor Hartwell, whose companionship brought me great joy in my final years, I leave the sum of £3,000 to be invested in the funds so as to provide her with an annual income of approximately £120, that she might have the independence to choose her own path rather than being forced into servitude by circumstance." And Eleanor's breath stopped entirely because £120 a year was a modest but genuine independence, enough to rent a small cottage and live simply without employment, enough to read and walk and exist without bowing to the demands of difficult women who treated her as furniture, and the gift was so enormous, so transformative, so completely unexpected that she could not process it, could only sit frozen while Mr. Pemberton continued with minor bequests to distant cousins. When the reading concluded, the solicitor handed Eleanor a sealed letter addressed in Lady Thornbury's distinctive handwriting, and she took it with trembling hands, barely aware of Mr. Pemberton gathering his papers and departing with murmured condolences, barely aware of anything until the Duke's voice broke through her shock, saying gently, "She planned this carefully. She wanted you to have choices." And Eleanor looked up to find him watching her with an expression she could not decipher, something between sadness and hope and resignation, and she whispered, "I don't understand why she would do this for me. I was only her companion for a few months." But even as she spoke, she knew this was not entirely true, and that something deeper had passed between her and the old woman, some recognition and affection that transcended the boundaries of employment. The Duke moved closer and said, "My aunt saw you clearly, Eleanor. She saw your intelligence being wasted, your spirit being slowly crushed by the necessity of invisible servitude, and she wanted to give you what she herself never had until widowhood freed her, which was the ability to choose your life rather than having it chosen for you by poverty or propriety. And hearing him speak her given name so naturally, without the Miss Hartwell that marked distance and formality, made Eleanor's heart contract painfully, because they were alone now without Lady Thornbury's presence to mediate between them, alone with all the unspoken feelings and impossible longings that had driven Eleanor to flight months before, and she stood abruptly and said, "I should go. I need to think. I need to," but she could not articulate what she needed, because she was facing a terrifying question that Lady Thornbury's generosity had created. If she was no longer bound by financial necessity, if she could choose freely without fear of destitution, what did she actually want? And the answer, whispered through her like wind through empty rooms, was standing 3 feet away, watching her with dark eyes that contained their own careful hope. But wanting something and being able to accept it were entirely different challenges, and Eleanor fled the study, clutching the sealed letter like a talisman against the overwhelming possibility that her life might become something other than careful survival, might become something she had stopped letting herself imagine during 5 long years of making herself small and invisible and safe. Eleanor spent a week making arrangements, consulting with Mr. Pemberton about the investment of her inheritance, searching through advertisements for suitable cottages to let, and trying to ignore the fact that the Duke appeared at his aunt's house every day during this period, though he had no reason to be there anymore. With Lady Thornbury gone, the estate matters settled, the funeral concluded, and mourning begun. Yet he came nonetheless, and found excuses to cross her path in corridors or the garden, in his presence, both comfort and torment, because Eleanor knew what she had to do, even as every fibre of her being resisted doing it, knew she had to leave London and leave him, and build a life of careful solitude, rather than risk the impossible dream his steady gaze seemed to offer. She found a cottage finally, a small stone dwelling in Derbyshire with a garden and 2 bedrooms and a rent of £25 annually, leaving her nearly £100 for living expenses, more money than she had ever commanded in her life. And when she told the Duke's housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, who had been handling correspondence for the estate, the older woman looked at her with something like pity and said, "His Grace will be sorry to see you go, Miss," which was both too much acknowledgement and not nearly enough, and Eleanor fled before the woman could say anything more. The Duke found her in the garden 2 days before her planned departure, found her sitting on the stone bench where she and Lady Thornbury had often taken tea, and he sat beside her without invitation and said quietly, "May I call on you, Eleanor? In Derbyshire, once you're settled, may I visit?" And the question was so gentle, so carefully phrased to give her every opportunity to refuse without humiliation, that Eleanor felt her heart crack, because he was trying to make this possible, trying to bridge the impossible gap between them, and she had to be the one with enough sense for both of them. She turned to face him and said, "Your Grace, you know that's impossible, the difference in our stations, the gossip it would cause, the presumption people would make." And he said, "I don't care what people presume." But Eleanor shook her head and continued, "But I care, I must care, because I have spent 5 years learning exactly how precarious my position is, how easily a woman without fortune can be ruined by association with someone above her station. And I have finally, miraculously, been given independence, and I cannot risk it. I cannot risk becoming an object of scandal or speculation or pity." And she heard her voice rising with passion she could not control, heard herself saying things she had rehearsed, but which sounded hollow now when spoken aloud. The Duke listened without interrupting, his dark eyes never leaving her face, and when she finally fell silent, breathless and miserable, he asked only one question, his voice very low and very steady, "Are you refusing because you don't care for me, Eleanor, or because you do?" And the question hung in the air between them like something sharp and glittering, demanding honesty she was not prepared to give, because if she admitted the truth that she had been half in love with him since their first library conversation, that she thought of him constantly, that his presence made her feel seen and valued in ways she had forgotten were possible, then she would have no defense left against hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing she could allow herself. So she stood abruptly and said, "I cannot answer that question, Your Grace. Please do not ask it of me." And she walked away quickly before he could see the tears that were sliding down her cheeks, walked away from the only person who had ever looked at her and seen not a useful employee, or a tolerable companion, or an invisible necessity, but simply Eleanor, complex and intelligent, and worthy of being known, and the leaving felt like tearing something vital from her chest. But she did it anyway because 5 years of survival had taught her that safety mattered more than happiness. That caution was wisdom and hope was foolishness, even as a small voice whispered that Lady Thornbury had warned against exactly this choice, had begged her not to let fear make her small. But Eleanor silenced that voice and kept walking, kept choosing the careful prison of solitude over the terrifying possibility of being truly, devastatingly seen. The cottage in Derbyshire was everything Eleanor had imagined when she signed the lease, small and stone with ivy climbing its eastern wall, a garden that had gone somewhat wild during its vacancy, 2 rooms downstairs and 2 above, windows that looked out over rolling hills where sheep grazed in distant fields. And yet when she arrived in late October with her few trunks and fewer expectations, when she unlocked the door and stepped into rooms that smelled of dust and disuse, she felt not the relief she had anticipated, but rather a hollowness that seemed to expand with each passing day until it filled every corner of her carefully chosen sanctuary. Winter came early that year, settling over the hills like a held breath, and Eleanor established routines meant to give shape to days that otherwise threatened to blur into formless succession. She rose at dawn and lit fires, prepared simple meals, walked the frozen lanes wrapped in her warmest cloak, read by lamplight until her eyes ached, and tried not to think about the question the Duke had asked in Lady Thornbury's garden, tried not to examine too closely why she had fled rather than answering honestly. She read voraciously during those months, worked through volumes of poetry and philosophy she had accumulated over years of employment, books that had been her companions when human connection proved too dangerous or complicated. But now the words seemed to slide across her mind without penetrating, and she found herself reading the same passages repeatedly without comprehension, found herself staring into the fire and remembering library conversations, the way the Duke's voice deepened when discussing ideas that moved him, the rare smile that transformed his austere features into something approaching warmth. The freedom she had thought she wanted, had spent 5 years dreaming about during countless hours of reading aloud to difficult women and managing their trivial correspondence, felt instead like exile, like she had traded one prison for another. And the terrible realization that came to her slowly through the long winter nights was that she had been running not from the Duke, but from vulnerability itself, from the terrifying possibility of being truly known and then perhaps rejected. From hope, which seemed infinitely more dangerous than resignation, because hope could shatter while resignation merely endured. She thought often of Lady Thornbury's final whispered words, "Times don't let fear make you small times," and understood with growing clarity that she had spent 5 years making herself systematically smaller, learning to disappear into wallpaper and silence, learning to want nothing and expect less. And now, when offered the chance to expand into a larger life, to be visible and vulnerable and fully present, she had chosen instead this careful solitude that felt less like freedom and more like slow suffocation. Spring came late to Derbyshire, snow lingering in shadowed corners well into March. But when it finally arrived, it came with sudden violence, crocuses pushing through frozen ground and birds returning with raucous celebration, and Eleanor stood in her wild garden one morning, watching new life force its way into existence, and realized with perfect, painful clarity that she had made a catastrophic mistake, that fear was not sufficient reason to refuse happiness, that 5 years of companionship had taught her how to survive, but not how to live, and if she wanted to become something more than a ghost haunting her own carefully constructed prison, she would need to find courage she was not certain she possessed, would need to risk rejection and humiliation and heartbreak, would need to travel to Greystone and speak the truth she had been too frightened to acknowledge when the Duke asked his impossible question, which was that she cared for him desperately. They had cared since their first conversation about Dante, and that caring terrified her more than anything she had ever faced because it meant becoming visible again, meant stepping out of protective shadows into light that might reveal her as insufficient or unworthy. But the alternative was this half-life of careful solitude, and Eleanor discovered she could no longer bear it. Eleanor took the mail coach north in early April, her small valise containing only necessities and the first edition of Browning the Duke had given her months ago, A talisman of courage she carried like a promise to herself that she would not flee this time, would not choose safety over truth, and the journey to Greystone took 2 days through countryside transformed by spring, orchards foaming white with blossoms and fields greening after winter's surrender, and Eleanor watched the landscape change through coach windows and felt her heart hammering against her ribs with a terror that was somehow exhilarating, because she was choosing this, was stepping deliberately toward vulnerability rather than away from it, though she had no assurance of welcome or reciprocation, and every possibility of humiliation, because 5 months had passed since she had walked away from the Duke's question without answering, 5 months during which he might have decided she was not worth the complexity she brought to his orderly life, might have concluded that her refusal was answer enough. She hired a cart in the village near Greystone to carry her to the estate, arrived unannounced because announcement would have given her too much time to reconsider, to turn back, to choose the familiar prison of fear over the terrifying freedom of hope, and when the house came into view, a great stone edifice of grey stone and mullioned windows set among ancient oaks, Eleanor felt simultaneously that she was making either the bravest or most foolish decision of her life, and she could not determine which until she faced the Duke and spoke the words she had rehearsed through sleepless nights in her Derbyshire cottage. The butler who answered her knock looked startled to see her, but admitted her with professional courtesy when she asked if His Grace was at home, and he led her not to a receiving room, but through the house to the gardens, because, he explained, the Duke spent most afternoons there since the weather had turned fine, and Eleanor followed him through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors until they emerged into formal gardens, where spring had exploded in riots of daffodils and early roses, and there, kneeling among flower beds with soil on his hands and shirt-sleeves rolled to his elbows, was the Duke, looking so different from the austere figure she had known in London that Eleanor stopped walking and simply stared until he glanced up and saw her, and went absolutely still. She dismissed the butler with a gesture before the man could announce her, needed to do this without witnesses or formality, and she walked forward across perfect lawn until she stood at the garden's edge, looking down at the Duke, who had risen to his feet but made no move to approach her, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent, and Eleanor drew a breath that seemed to fill her entire body, and said without preamble, "I was afraid I have been afraid for so long that I forgot what it feels like to want something more than safety, to risk heartbreak for the possibility of happiness, and you asked me a question in Lady Thornbury's garden that I could not answer, because answering honestly would have destroyed every defense I had built during 5 years of making myself invisible. But I can answer now. I must answer now because winter in Derbyshire taught me that survival is not the same as living, and fear is not sufficient reason to refuse joy. So I will tell you the truth, which is that I care for you desperately. I have cared since our first conversation about Dante, though I would not admit it even to myself, and I know the gap between our positions makes this impossible by every measure society recognizes. I know I bring you nothing but complication and potential scandal, but I had to come here and tell you that I was wrong to walk away, wrong to choose pride over honesty, wrong to let fear make me small, when you had offered me the extraordinary gift of being truly seen, and if you have moved past whatever you felt in those library conversations, if 5 months of my cowardice has convinced you I am not worth the trouble I would undoubtedly bring to your life, then I will accept that and leave and never trouble you again. But I needed you to know that I refused, not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much, and that has made all the difference." The Duke stood motionless among his roses for what seemed an eternity after Eleanor's words fell into silence between them, his eyes never leaving her face, and she watched emotions move across his austere features like clouds across a March sky, surprise, followed by something that might have been pain, followed by something else she could not quite name, but that made her breath catch in her throat, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as though he had not used it properly in months, which perhaps he had not. "I thought your refusal meant indifference," he said, and Eleanor heard in those words the echo of her own winter isolation. "I thought when you walked away that I had misread everything, that the conversations we shared meant nothing beyond pleasant discourse to pass time, that I had projected my own desperate loneliness onto neutral kindness and made a fool of myself by hoping for more, but I could not quite convince myself to stop hoping even when logic demanded it. even when 5 months passed without word, and I told myself daily that you had made your position clear, and I should respect it and move forward with my life, as it was before you entered Lady Thornbury's drawing room and made me remember what it felt like to be fully alive. He stepped forward then, closing the distance between them until Eleanor could see soil under his fingernails and a smudge of dirt on his collar, and the way his dark eyes had gone brilliant with something she recognized now as hope tempered by caution, and he continued speaking as though the words had been damming up inside him for months and now could not be stopped. "You brought light back into a world that had gone grey after Catherine's death," he said, and Eleanor noticed he spoke his late wife's name without the careful distance he had maintained in their early conversations, as though Eleanor's honesty had given him permission for his own, not because you tried to replace what I had lost, but because you were so entirely yourself, brilliant and careful and kind and afraid. Yes, I saw your fear even when you thought yourself invisible, saw how you had learned to make yourself small to survive in a world that had no proper place for women like you. Women too educated for servitude, but too poor for society. And I wanted to give you space to be large again, to take up room and speak your mind and exist without apology. Wanted it so desperately that I forgot to guard my own heart against the possibility that you might not want the same thing, might not see in me anything beyond an employer's nephew who paid you more attention than was strictly proper." He paused then, seemed to gather himself, and Eleanor saw his hands tremble slightly before he clasped them behind his back, as though to prevent himself from reaching for her before he had permission. "I do not ask for an answer now," he said quietly. "I do not ask for anything except the chance to court you properly, openly, to let our relationship begin again without the constraints of your employment or my aunt's household or the weight of expectations we both carried, to discover together whether what we found in those library conversations can grow into something lasting and real. And if you will grant me that chance, if you will allow me to call on you and write to you and build something honest between us, then I will wait as long as necessary for you to feel certain. Will wait years if that is what you require, because Eleanor, you are worth waiting for. You have always been worth far more than the world has given you, and if you will let me, I would spend my life trying to show you that truth." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her face, though she had not realized she was crying, felt something tight and cold in her chest, loosen and warm and expand until she could breathe properly, for what felt like the first time in 5 years, and she smiled at this man who stood before her, covered in garden soil, and offering her not a proposal but an invitation to partnership, to being fully seen and valued, and she said simply, "Yes, yes, I will grant you that chance, will grant us both that chance, because I am tired of being afraid and ready to discover what we might become together." Months later, when summer had deepened into golden abundance across Greystone's vast parklands, Eleanor found herself transformed in ways both visible and invisible, though the transformation had come gradually through accumulated moments rather than sudden revelation, through morning walks in the Duke's gardens, where he taught her the names of roses his late wife had planted, and she taught him to see the mathematical patterns in flower arrangements, through afternoon letters that arrived at her Derbyshire cottage with such regularity that the postmaster began to smile knowingly when he handed them to her, through evening visits, when the Duke would drive the 20 miles from Greystone to sit in her modest parlour and discuss philosophy and poetry and the ordinary details of their separate days, as though such sharing were the most natural thing in the world. Society noticed, of course, because society always noticed when a duke paid attention to anyone, and the gossip that had simmered during Eleanor's employment at Lady Thornbury's now boiled over into drawing rooms across 3 counties, ladies whispering behind fans about the impoverished companion who had somehow ensnared the Duke of Greystone, gentlemen making crude speculations about the nature of their relationship, dowagers declaring it all highly irregular and predicting scandal. But the Duke's rank provided a shield that Eleanor's previous positions had never offered, and he made clear through both action and word that anyone who spoke ill of Miss Hartwell would find themselves unwelcome at Greystone, and by extension, unwelcome in much of polite society, which proved remarkably effective at silencing the more vicious tongues. Eleanor learned during those months to navigate the Duke's world without losing herself within it, to attend dinners at Greystone where she was introduced not as a companion or employee, but simply as Miss Hartwell, a friend of the family, to converse with county ladies who looked down their noses at her modest dress, until the Duke made clear his regard for her opinions, to accept the reality that she would always be scrutinized more carefully than someone born to privilege, but that such scrutiny need not determine her worth or her happiness. The Duke, in turn, learned to see beyond the rigid hierarchies that had structured his entire life, to recognize that character mattered more than quarterings on a coat of arms, that Eleanor's intelligence and kindness and hard-won strength made her more suitable as a partner than any appropriately bred lady who had never known struggle or developed resilience through necessity, and he began to understand that what he had mistaken for proper social order was often merely comfortable prejudice that prevented genuine connection. The proposal came in October, nearly a year after their courtship had begun, on an afternoon when they walked together through Greystone's beechwood and the leaves overhead burned gold and crimson against an impossibly blue sky. And the Duke stopped beside an ancient tree and took Eleanor's hand and said without preamble that he did not want to spend another winter without her, and did not want to return each evening to a house that felt empty, despite its many rooms, did not want to wake each morning without the knowledge that she would be there to share the day's small joys and inevitable sorrows, and he asked not whether she would marry him, but whether she would be his partner in building a life that honored both of them, that made space for her love of learning and his need for purpose, that created something new rather than forcing her to fit into something old. Eleanor said yes, with tears streaming down her face and laughter breaking through her voice, said yes to partnership and possibility and the terrifying, beautiful prospect of being fully known and fully loved, said yes to a future she had not dared to imagine during those 5 years of making herself invisible in other women's houses. And the Duke kissed her there among the golden leaves with a tenderness that felt like coming home to a place she had never known existed. 3 years after Eleanor Hartwell became the Duchess of Greystone, on an April afternoon, when sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the estate's library and illuminated dust motes that drifted like golden snow through air, scented with leather bindings and beeswax and the sweet violet perfume. Eleanor had finally allowed herself to wear without guilt. She sat in the window seat with her daughter Anne perched on one side and her son Thomas on the other, reading aloud from a collection of fairy tales, while both children listened with the peculiar intensity of the very young encountering magic for the first time, and she thought with quiet wonder how impossible this scene would have seemed. To the woman who had arrived at the Ashford estate 6 years ago, with nothing but a worn travelling cloak and carefully guarded dignity, and the bone-deep certainty that she would live and die invisible in other women's houses. The Duke entered the library as she finished the tale of the princess who learned to speak honestly instead of prettily, and both children immediately abandoned their mother to rush toward their father, with demands that he settle some dispute about whether dragons preferred gold or jewels. And Eleanor watched her husband kneel on the Persian carpet to engage in serious negotiation with a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, as though their concerns mattered as much as any parliamentary debate, watched the way his severe face softened into laughter when Thomas insisted dragons actually preferred cake, watched the tender patience with which he listened to Anne's elaborate theory about dragon dietary preferences, and she felt her heart expand with a love that had deepened rather than diminished, with time and familiarity, and the ordinary struggles of building a life together. When the children finally released him and went to play with wooden blocks in the corner, the Duke crossed to Eleanor and drew her to her feet and into his arms in a gesture that had become so natural over 3 years of marriage that she no longer felt the instinct to pull away or make herself smaller or wonder if she deserved such tenderness, and he said quietly into her hair the words he had spoken on their wedding day and repeated countless times since, with no diminishment of sincerity, "You are my greatest treasure, Eleanor, not despite where you came from, but because of who you became through it, because you learned strength and compassion and courage in circumstances that might have made you bitter or small, and I am grateful every day that you found the bravery to risk hoping again, and to come to my gardens that spring morning and tell me you were ready to stop running from the possibility of happiness." Eleanor lifted her face to kiss him gently, tasting in that kiss all the ordinary extraordinary days they had shared and would share, the arguments and reconciliations and quiet evenings and shared laughter and the slow, patient work of building partnership. And she thought how Lady Thornbury had been right, that fear must not be allowed to make us small, how the 5 years she had spent learning to disappear had taught her exactly what she was willing to risk visibility for, how the greatest courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to reach for joy despite it. Dear listener, perhaps you too have learned to make yourself invisible, to guard your heart so carefully that no one can see inside, to believe that safety lies in expecting nothing and risking less, and perhaps like Eleanor you have convinced yourself that this is wisdom rather than wound speaking. But I would gently suggest that there is a difference between protecting yourself and imprisoning yourself, between caution and the refusal to hope, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is allow ourselves to be fully seen by someone who has earned the privilege of seeing us, to speak our truth even when our voices shake, to reach for happiness even when we cannot guarantee the outcome, and to trust that we are worth the very love and partnership and joy that we have spent years telling ourselves we do not deserve or cannot have or should not want. Your worth is not determined by the positions you have held, or the houses you have served, or the ways the world has tried to make you small. You carry within you the same capacity for transformation that Eleanor discovered, the same potential for a life built on honesty rather than fear, on connection rather than isolation, on the courage to hope even after hope has disappointed you, and if you will grant yourself permission to want more than mere survival, to believe that you deserve to be valued for exactly who you are, to risk the vulnerability of being fully known and fully present in your own life, then perhaps you too will discover that the greatest treasures are not the things we grasp, but the moments we allow ourselves to receive. May you find the courage to stop making yourself invisible. May you discover partnership that honors your whole self. May you learn that fear is not enough reason to refuse joy, and may you rest tonight knowing that your story, like Eleanor's, is still being written, and the best chapters may yet lie ahead. This story comes to you from Whispered Chronicles, where we believe every heart deserves to hope again. Please like and subscribe to hear more tales of transformation and the courage to be seen.